I'm here to speak specifically about how can we assess the meaning and value of two nonviolent campaigns conducted by Syrian women. The Stop the Killing campaign with some 25 events in 2012 and the Brides of Freedom March, a one-time event on November 21, 2012, within the larger context of the Syrian revolution. The Stop the Killing campaign began with a one-woman stand by then 32-year-old lawyer Rima Zadi. In a red raincoat, she silently held a red banner in the middle of traffic near Parliament building in Damascus as onlookers clapped and cheered, and still, before being taken into arbitrary detention. The banner said, "Stop the killing, we want to build a country for all Syrians." The security agent demanded of Rima, "Which side are you on?" She refused to answer, except to say, "Ana Suriya," I am Syrian. In Arabic, all nouns are gendered, so she was also saying, "I am a Syrian woman." And here, if you would show the first clip, please.
Lights.
And let me know when it's over. When it's over, please. Let me know when it's over, since I can't see.
Yes, we will, Mohja. Okay, Mohja.
Okay. Between April and July 2012, the colors of Stop the Killing flew all the way in the north of Syria in traditionally Kurdish areas such as Amuda, to the south in Sueda, a predominantly Druze area, as well as in Aleppo and several conservative Sunni small towns and countryside villages around Damascus, such as Tel and Duma. The red and white colors were chosen to evince the same neutrality about which side are you on, as did Rima's answer to the state police on April 8th. This neutrality had been carefully strategized to draw in all Syrian onlookers and to put on display the regime's arbitrary imprisonment of nonviolent activists for the public to witness. Rima did not act alone on April 8th, nor did the Four Brides of Freedom March alone, any more than Rosa Parks acted alone when she refused to move on the bus. The Stop the Killing campaign was an outgrowth of that nonviolent, youthful, diverse, geographically widespread, rural and small-town heavy civilian population that began the revolution in Syria and dominated its nonviolent phase. Stop the Killing was conceived with larger aims. Now, the Syrian revolution can be divided into three phases. Phase 1, from March to August 2011, was nonviolent by collective conscious choice. Despite Isolated incidents of violence, which are exceptions that prove the rule in the very fact that people want to deny them because they knew there was a consensus around nonviolence. The first state uprising was a organic, homegrown, Syria-centric, rural and small-town dominated, community-based, secular, non-sectarian, youth and woman-led, and unified around regime change, human rights and freedoms, and secular pluralistic democracy. There is a great deal of blather about a fractious opposition. This comes from looking only at traditional political actors such as opposition councils formed abroad by graying dissidents who did not start this revolution. This fractious opposition line also comes from looking at armed actors who entered only later in the Syrian revolution. Civilians built a movement for 5.5 months before the secular Free Syrian Army declared formation on July 29, 2011, and way before armed extremists entered the picture in 2012 or foreign jihadists in 2013. A community-based uprising existed in Syria for 6 months before the Syrian National Council formed abroad in August 2011, in which traditional opposition parties and the Syrian Brotherhood finagled large blocks of seats. No one in Syrian activism can place opposition with the revolution. The revolution came from consciousness change, lit by a spark from the self-immolation of 26-year-old Mohammed Bouazizi on December 17, 2010, in the neglected southern region of Tunisia, signaling his despair of having a dignified life in a peace state. It came from the energy Syrian youth saw in Egypt at Tahrir Square, whose cadres had mobilized in part around 20-something Khalid Said in June 2010, who was photocopying evidence of police corruption when police bludgeoned him to death. Syrian protesters I interviewed, when asked why did they protest, answered that we began to see that we weren't living like human beings, and we want to live like human beings. And several other speakers have made reference to that moment of consciousness change. The Assad regime responded to nonviolent protests with long habitual police state brutality, with ground troops, tank and machine gun fire, snipers, home raids, detention suites, and unofficial regime militias permitted to kidnap, loot, and rape, as well as with media state. Protests topped 920 locations in 1 week, and a crowd of 400,000 filled the city of Hamad al Square in early 2011, with scenes of food sharing and other non-violent fraternization with police, high ethics, songs, interreligious embrace, and women's visibility. Hamad al Square protests, lasting regularly throughout July 2011, was similar to the scene in Egypt's Tahrir Square, but was almost entirely uncovered by global media. This entire phase of the Syrian revolution was minimally covered by international media and seemed to pass unnoticed by peace and justice communities in countries outside the region. Phase 2 of the Syrian revolution saw both nonviolent and violent resistance to the regime, with civilians being detained and tortured at much more severe levels than prior, or killed by lethal regime fire, and particularly because of regime tactics of house-to-house raids and sniper fire in neighborhoods. The pressure to turn to armed self-defense was intense, and the nonviolent consensus faltered, then paved over the course of this phase. Phase 2, the mixed phase, saw the beginning of militarization and the proliferation of brigades of armed rebels of various sorts using the name Free Syrian Army. Nonviolent protests continued in smaller but still relatively strong numbers of locales, stopping at 300, for example, in 1 week. And the mixed phase lasted from August to December 2011. Phase 3 was when armed resistance began to dominate the scene, and external agendas tried to ride the youth-led revolution, entering through the newly created window of the need for armed donors. Assad first began to use airstrikes in this third phase against civilians and armed brigades alike. Armed resistance became widespread in Phase 3, turning many cities into pitched battle zones, closing off many street venues where nonviolent protests had been taking place. During this phase, nonviolent resistance became less visible, but evolved into activities having perhaps more lasting impact. The work of building an alternate state underground of schools and presses and field hospitals and alternate food and electricity distribution systems, and even like the garbage collection systems that Leila mentioned. Both these nonviolent campaigns, the Stop the Killing campaign and the Brides of Freedom March, are remarkable for occurring during that third phase in 2012 after armed resistance to the regime had become widespread. And visible nonviolent resistance seemed to be on the decline, giving a huge boost to the regime narrative that it was battling armed extremists. Emergence of an armed flank in any revolution tends to shrink participation in it by civilians. So both these campaigns had to work against this challenge to try to revitalize nonviolent resistance in Syria. Both campaigns were also led by women, even though militarization phases in any revolution usually result in the marginalization of women's active participation in the revolution. While elements of intolerance of religious pluralism were on the rise in armed sectors of the revolution, both these campaigns had a strong presence of minority members and were also embraced by women of the Sunni majority, even in towns known for conservatism, such as Douma and Fez. Women of Sueda, part of southern Syria that is historically home to Syria's Druze population, were very active in the Stop the Killing campaign, and its initiator, Rima Dali, is Alawite, originally from Latakia in the coastal area. All four members of the one-time event called the March of the Brides of Freedom were members of minority religious communities in Syria. Rima plus two sisters from Sueda, Kinda and Lubna Za'awar, and the youngest bride, Ru'a Ja'far, was from Salamiyya, historically home to Syria's Ismailiyya Shia population, and an early and constant protest hotspot. These four women dressed in white wedding gowns entered the busy marketplace of Midhat Souk in the heart of Damascus near noon on November 21, 2012. And again, to ululations and clapping, they unfurled their banners, also red and white, only to be accosted by security agents and carted away to be imprisoned, in this case, for 49 days. And here I'd like to show the second clip. And I'm going to start speaking before this clip ends. In fact, I'll just continue speaking. If you want to turn the sound down a little bit on the video clip this time, I can continue speaking through it.
Go ahead, Mohja.
Okay. Videos of their march were immediately uploaded to the YouTube channel of Freedom Days, a consortium of dozens of grassroots youth civilian resistance groups in Syria, including the Syrian Nonviolence Movement, a group formed in April 2011 with two members who are attending among you today who want me to give our organization a shout out, the Syrian Nonviolence Movement. In fact, the bride's male associate who filmed them is a member of Freedom Days, showing the civilian grassroots revolution network to which these women are meaningfully connected. So, assessing the costs and benefits here, no one was ever killed at a Stop the Killing event or in the Brides of Freedom March. These campaigns incurred a relatively low cost for their active participants, that being the prospect of imprisonment. They incurred an even lower cost on passive but supportive participants. But even that passive support in the presence of the threat of arrest is, as you can see by the choices of other bystanders in this video, is a high enough cost for many Syrians as to be prohibited, especially in Damascus. These actions managed to focus an amount of publicity on the regime's brutality, which was being hidden under the highly legible violence of the armed resistance, and giving the regime a legitimacy boost to its narrative that from the start it was battling armed extremist gangs. These events forced the regime back into that defensive, bewildered posture that initial civil resistance put them in. The two events differ in respect to gender specificity. The Stop the Killing campaign, though initiated and led by women, was not gender specific. The Brides of Freedom March, in contrast, capitalizes on gender roles. It turns the white robed bride, paradoxically, into an icon of powerful silent protest. It is clever, knowing the audience of its street theater. Who doesn't love looking at a bride? This is something that crosses over among women of all religious sects in Syria. But ironically, the Stop the Killing campaign earned itself a reputation as girly and was brushed aside in the increasingly militarized atmosphere of the revolution in Syria, where the icon of the man with the gun was seen as more sexual than the girls with the flowers. Some revolution activists were outright hostile towards Stop the Killing. By frankly embracing gender specificity, though slyly turning it into something more than patriarchally conceived view of brides allowed, the Brides of Freedom March dodged that bullet and got a different kind of reception in its target audience. Well, one could say, well, both campaigns failed. They didn't bring down the regime. While they were both acts from the grassroots revolution youth ultimately want the fall of the regime and the rise of the pluralistic democratic state of Syria, obviously, no one expected these specific actions by themselves to often bring down the regime. These actions succeeded at what they strategically aimed to do, pull legitimacy away from the regime narrative and remind civilians that they had a choice and were active agents in this revolution. Consciousness change, that consciousness change moment again, at the heart of human beings. Armed resistance takes away the empowerment of the ordinary person that this revolution is all about. These two actions initiated by Syrian women worked uphill during phase 3 to restore the sense of personal empowerment and finding the voice to speak out. They reopened the possibility of participation for so many civilians to whom it had been closed by armed struggles. In reality, civil resistance succeeded and armed resistance has failed this revolution. A regime significantly weakened by civil resistance in the first phase of the conflict regained its initiative when faced with armed rebels, who also failed their promise of defending civilians. We are now in late 2003, in what you might call phase 4, a much later stage of the unfolding saga in Syria than when these two actions took place. Syria's civilian resistance has been killed and imprisoned by the Assad regime, marginalized by diasporic political oppositionists, and faces new repression by armed extremists. The escalating violence has mushroomed to a scale that seems to grind to dust the consciousness change of human beings, which this revolution began. This is an illusion. Shadow is always an illusion, though it claims always to be reality. That consciousness change is reality. And after the romance of armed liberation fades, civil resistance's people power will still be there, renewed every day from the grassroots, more powerful and inexhaustible than even itself knows itself to be, abused and starved as it is now. Neither Islamist nor fraction, and nobody's up. Civilian resistance is the only hope for a democratic post-Assad Syria. And let me just add that these highly visible acts of nonviolent resistance may not have brought down the regime, but they must be seen as a part of a lineage of later acts. They mothered other highly visible acts of nonviolent resistance in Syria. So, for example, the Tel women's participation in the Stop the Killing campaign feeds into the series of other acts of these young women activists then. They are called the Green Ribbon Girls, who, despite the conservatism of the town and family pressures not to do street activities, have a clear vision of non-theocratic pluralistic democracy as their goal and are street active. Acts mothered by the two campaigns I described here include the ongoing one-woman stand of Su'ad Nawfal in Raqqa, the first entire governorate in Syria to be wrested from Assad control, though still subjected to Assad bombing, but which, after a window of struggle, fell under the control of Daesh or ISIS, jihadists who are restraining freedoms in a way people there find reminiscent of the authoritarian Assad regime that they rebelled against. Saad has been protesting in front of the jihadist headquarters since the kidnapping by these jihadists of Father Paulo and of Firas al-Hajj Saleh. Her most recent act was in protest of these jihadist desecration of two churches in Raqqa. Neither is she acting alone, any more than Rimat Ali acted alone. The stand of Su'ad of Raqqa and many other acts of nonviolent resistance in Syria to which the women of Stop the Killing gave a predecessor, a model, and a mother are still being birthed in Syria. Thank you.